In the Jedi archives on Coruscant, one rule was treated as absolute. If a record did not appear in the archive, then it did not exist. For centuries, no name strained that rule more than Revan's. He had begun as a Padawan, risen to knight, then master, and with each step had become harder to define. He was hailed as a hero, denounced as a traitor, feared as a conqueror, and remembered as a savior. He had worn the robes of the Jedi, and later the armor of the Sith. He had saved the Republic, then tried to destroy it, then saved it again. So when he stood before the Council for the last time, the Masters could not agree on what to do with him. A handful wanted him cast out of the Order entirely. Others chose a quieter path. They would not disown him, and they would not embrace him. The tale of his redemption and return to the light spread across the galaxy, but the darker details of what the Jedi had done to him were carefully removed. The man behind the legend was locked inside the walls of the temple, and the parts of his life that did not suit the Order were shut away. This is the history the Council could not control, so they buried it. It begins with a war they refused to fight. It started in the Outer Rim, where Mandalorian raiders began striking Republic colonies on a scale the Senate could no longer dismiss. The scope of that campaign is charted in Legends reference works like the New Essential Chronology and Star Wars The Essential Atlas, which trace the war world by worlds across the Rim. What those records track is the movement of fleets. What the novel Revan sits with is the part the maps cannot show, the moment the Council chose not to respond. Whole worlds lived in fear, and as refugees streamed towards the core, pressure built for someone to act. The Republic Senate debated and delayed. The Jedi Council, sitting in its halls on Coruscant, chose to wait. That choice created the space for one young Jedi Knight to do the opposite. His name was Revan. With him was his closest friend and apprentice Malak. The Council would not move. They left the temple for the Outer Worlds and did what the Masters had refused to do. The Council opposed them openly and offered them to stand down. Revan and Malak ignored them. Instead, they pulled Jedi from across the Order, knights, Padawans, former students, even those who had drifted from active service, and marched them into the war alongside Republic soldiers. What began as defiance quickly hardened into something larger, a chain of command of their own, built beyond the Council's reach. One of the first to join them was a young woman named Meetra Surik. Because she quickly proved herself a brilliant tactician and a natural military leader, Revan recognized her value at once, made her a general, and placed nearly half of the combined Republic and Jedi forces under her command. This was no longer a disagreement because what Revan had created in the field had already become a second Jedi hierarchy, complete with its own ranks and its own officers. Back at the temple, the old masters watched the war from a distance. Among them was Atris, once close to Meetra, and now firmly aligned with the Council's most conservative view. She had stayed out of the fighting because she believed, as they did, that Revan's defiance could not be allowed to stand, but on the battlefield, that judgment mattered less with every victory he won. Revan's army was the force actually turning the war. It met the Mandalorians world by world, system by system, and every success made his name larger across the galaxy. That was exactly what made him more dangerous inside the Order. Each victory strengthened his legend. Each loss only hardened the Masters against him. Some resented the cost in Jedi lives. Others resented something simpler and more threatening. Revan had shown that he could lead without them. As the war dragged on, the divide only deepened. Worlds burned, colonies were lost and retaken, and young Jedi who had known only the temple learned instead how to command troops, survive campaigns, and bury the dead. By the end, the conflict was no longer just a war against the Mandalorians. It had become a struggle over who would define the future of the Jedi Order itself. Revan meant to settle both struggles with one final victory, and that was why he chose Malachor V. The planet mattered less than the space around it, where violent gravitational anomalies could be turned into a weapon. He already had that weapon prepared, the mass shadow generator. It appears not only in the novel Revan, but also in the Prima official game guide for Knights of the Old Republic 2. The guide describes it with the cold precision of battlefield machinery. The novel lingers on what that machinery cost. Revan built the battle as a trap. He split his fleet in two, gave half to Meetra, and kept the rest for himself. While he engaged Mandalore directly, Meetra's fleet would draw the Mandalorians close to the planet and hold them there. The plan only worked if her ships remained in position long enough for the generator to fire. She held her position exactly as ordered, keeping the Mandalorians close enough to seal the trap around Malachor V. When the generator fired, space itself folded inward, tearing apart every ship in orbit in a single instant. The Mandalorian fleet was destroyed there, and most of Meetra's was destroyed with it. The war ended in the same moment thousands of her own people died. Meetra survived, but barely. She had been close enough to the weapon that the shockwave nearly killed her. It left her vulnerable. At the same time, she felt the loss of the Mandalorians and her fellow soldiers through the Force. Every life, every voice, all of them cut off together. For a Jedi, it was beyond pain, because nothing in their training had prepared them to feel that many lives vanish at once. It became a wound her teachings could not contain, and with no way to endure it, she protected herself the only way she knew how. She cut herself off from the Force, and for years, it seemed permanent. What the weapon did to the planet was still. Malachor V did not simply become a dead world, it became a scar in the Force itself, a wound that would not heal. Any Force-sensitive who came near would feel echoes of unimaginable pain and suffering, the last moments of everyone who had died there, repeating in the currents of the Force. Malachor remained a place of extraordinary dread and trauma in the Force. Revan had won his war, but he had won it through a single calculated sacrifice that never stopped shadowing the victory. Years later, after his own memories of the event were gone, he would try to look back on those choices and find that he cannot fully explain or justify them, even to himself. He did not know whether he had understood what would happen. He did not know whether the plan had gone wrong or unfolded exactly as he had intended. The records were sealed after Malachor V. The mission report was locked away in the Jedi archives under restricted access, and the men and women who had survived returned to a republic that had already decided it did not want to hear what they had endured. Meetra Surik, who had obeyed Revan's orders and paid for them more dearly than most, found that there was no place left for her in the world she had fought to save, so she simply walked away. Revan did not come home, and neither did Malak. With the Mandalorians broken, Revan chose to pursue the scattered remnants of their fleet beyond the edge of charted space. Malak went with him, past the Outer Rim, and into the unknown regions where Republic maps simply ended. Officially, they were finishing the war. In reality, they found something else. The two Jedi who had refused Council orders and won a war they were forbidden to fight did not return as heroes. They did not return as Jedi at all. What came back into Republic space were the same ships, but not the same men. Revan wore a different mask and carried a different title. So did Malak. They were called Darth now. When the Council finally offered an official explanation, they gave one that placed the blame on the ancient power of a Rakatan superweapon, a relic of a long-dead empire known as the Starforge. It had been in the unknown regions, they said, and it had bent the two men to its will. That was the version passed on to the Republic's historians. Even years later, Revan never fully accepted that explanation, because too much of what had happened to him remained hidden behind gaps in his own memory. He suspected there was more. He could not remember what it was. He could only remember that he had feared it on a deep, primal level. Something he had seen out there that was greater than the Mandalorians, greater than the Starforge, greater than anything the galaxy had yet faced. Whatever he had found, he came back to burn the Republic he had just saved. The Sith War that followed cost millions of lives, as the armies Revan had once built to protect the Outer Rim were turned against the Republic itself, and because of that, worlds fell and fleets burned. Cities that had hung his portrait as a liberator learned that the man in the portrait was now the one ordering them shelled. At his side stood Malak, no longer friend or student alone, but apprentice. For the Jedi, that new war did not erase the old one. Masters who had once resented Revan for leading thousands of their own to die in the Mandalorian Wars now watched him kill Republic soldiers and civilians by the million. The grievances piled on top of one another until none could be separated from the rest, and because of that, no single framing could contain him. He was, by turns, traitor and conqueror, apostate and emperor. Because the Republic somehow held on long enough, the Jedi were able to rally, and eventually, by means the Republic would never fully learn, the war against Darth Revan ended not in defeat on the battlefield, but with a strike team that managed, against long odds, to take the Dark Lord alive. What happened to Revan after his capture was not written into any ceremony. They saved Revan's life, but only by stripping his memories. Reaching into him through the Force, they took away the man he had been, then began rebuilding what remained. What they shaped was not the Revan who had defied them, and not the Darth who had burned Republic worlds, but a new man carrying pieces of both. And because Malak had already betrayed his master, fired on his flagship, and seized the remnant Sith Empire for himself, the Council suddenly had a use for Revan. They aimed him at the apprentice he had once trained, so they sent him out under the guidance of the young Jedi, Bastila and a small handful of companions, with the task of finding and killing Malak. For a time, the Council's gamble paid off. They rebuilt Revan, unaware for most of his journey of who he really was, hunted Malak across the galaxy. In doing so, he ended the Second War and saved the Republic a second time. But the deeper the hunt went, the more the old self began to return. His memories resurfaced in fragments, until by the time he faced Malak at the Starforge, he understood the truth completely. He knew that the hand the Council had raised against Malak was the same hand that had once raised Malak himself. He fought his apprentice and killed him anyway. The weapon the Council had forged recognized itself. When it was over, Revan returned to Coruscant as something the Jedi had no clear place for. To the Republic, the story was simple. The Senate awarded him the Cross of Glory, the highest honor it could give, and the ceremony was broadcast across the HoloNet. Across known space, people heard the same message. Revan had saved the Republic twice. But inside the temple, the truth was far less settled. Publicly, he had been redeemed and restored to the light. Privately, many masters did not believe redemption could erase what he had once become. The Council could give him a place in the public record. Within the Order, they still did not know what to call him. That uncertainty only deepened in the 2 years that followed, because during that time, Revan married Bastila. By Jedi standards, it was quiet, but it still broke doctrine outright. And to Revan, the marriage mattered for more than personal reasons. Bastila had been the one who found him, and during their hunt for Malak, she had briefly fallen to the dark side herself. Yet it had been his love that brought her back. Their bond had saved them both. To Revan, that made attachment more than emotion. It made it evidence that the Jedi had misunderstood something fundamental. By then, he had lived through both extremes of the Force. He had served the light completely, and he had fallen fully into the dark. He knew what it meant to deny emotion, and he knew what it meant to be consumed by it. Because he had known both, he came to believe that Jedi and Sith doctrine were flawed in the same way. To suppress emotion entirely was a fool's game. Jealousy was not simply evil waiting inside the soul. More often, it was what happened when a Jedi was taught to deny feeling instead of understanding it. From that, Revan drew a conclusion the Council could never have accepted. Love, loyalty, and happiness could strengthen a Jedi's bond to the Force, just as anger and hatred fed the dark side. So he brought that belief to the Council openly. He asked for a meeting and offered to share what he thought he had learned. What he received was not a debate, but hostility. Some masters wanted him banished outright. Others stopped short of that, not because they trusted him, but because they understood his legend was too useful to destroy. So they chose a colder compromise. Revan could remain within the Order, but only in silence. He could keep his place, his name, and his life in the temple, so long as he never taught what he had learned. The truth of what the Jedi had done to him was erased almost as completely as the man he had once been. The galaxy kept the legend because that was the version the Council allowed to survive. The truth stayed inside the temple, sealed away, with everything else that no longer fit the story. Around that same time, Meetra Surik returned after years of wandering, cut off from the Force and from the Order she had once followed into war. The Council did not welcome her back. Instead, they banished her. Atris, who had once been close to her, helped explain why. Meetra was no longer just a former Jedi. She had become a symbol of everyone who had defied the Council's will during the Mandalorian Wars. And once someone became a symbol, the Council no longer judged them as an individual. Mercy gave way to example, so Meetra was exiled, while Revan, the man who had led her into that war, was allowed to remain. It was a strange kind of arithmetic, but it reveals something more important about how the Council thought. Revan was dangerous, but still useful. Meetra represented disobedience itself, and symbols like that had to be pushed outside the walls. Revan noticed, and what happened to Meetra no longer looked like a single injustice. It looked like part of a larger pattern. The Council moved first against anything that threatened its authority, and that made him look again at the thing he had once encountered in the unknown regions. His memory of it had been damaged, but the fear had survived. It was still there, buried so deeply that it no longer needed clear shape or explanation. He knew with a certainty deeper than reason that what he had found beyond the edge of known space was worse than anything the Council had ever imagined, and he became convinced it was still waiting. He tried to warn others, but by then, he already knew what the Council would do. Even his allies spoke of it with a kind of weary certainty, as though the outcome had already been decided. They would say it almost without thinking, even if the Jedi Council refused to act again. And that word mattered, because it meant this was no longer a fear or a suspicion. The Council had begun noticing a pattern of its own. Bastila refused to return for retraining after everything she had endured, and some masters saw in that refusal the same danger they saw in Revan himself, another gifted Jedi drifting away from accepted doctrine. One exception had already caused enough damage. A second was intolerable, so Revan chose his companions carefully. He did not rely on the Jedi who still answered to the temple. He gathered people loyal to him, not the Council. Meetra came with him, her bond to the Force restored more deeply than she had believed possible. Together, they went into the unknown regions. For Revan, it was the second time he had crossed into that darkness. The first time, he had returned as a Sith Lord. This time, he said nothing to the Council at all. What they found began with Nathema, a dead world erased from charts and history by the Sith Emperor himself. Meetra felt the truth of it first. Malachor had screamed in the Force. Nathema did not scream at all. It was simply empty, a void so complete that it revealed the truth at once. Revan and Malak had not been turned by the Starforge. They had come here, seen what the Emperor could do, and knelt. What Nathema exposed was far worse than the Jedi had ever understood. The story told in the temple that Revan and Malak had been corrupted by the Starforge was not the truth, or not the whole of it. They had seen what was waiting in the dark beyond the Republic, and once Revan understood that, he pressed further. He crossed from the unknown regions into the hidden worlds of the Sith Empire itself, a civilization the Republic did not know existed, ruled by an immortal emperor whose name the Republic had never even heard. Once he understood what was waiting out there, he went after the Emperor directly. That choice led him into the Emperor's own throne chamber. Revan had come to end him, and he had brought allies because he knew no one reached that far alone. There, he fought with everything he had learned across 2 lifetimes of Force use. At the height of the battle, when the Emperor reached into his mind the same way the Jedi had years before, Revan answered with something no doctrine had prepared him to do. Because neither side alone was enough, he did not choose one. Instead of simply pressing forward, he opened himself to the Force and let both light and dark run through him like twin rushing rivers. He did not focus it or channel it, he released it in its purest form. It kept him alive. It did not win, and because he was taken alive, Revan was placed in a suspended cage of shimmering power, hanging somewhere between life and death. For however many centuries his body survived in stasis, Revan would fight back in the only way he still could, with his mind, against the mind of the thing that held him. He held on to that purpose to survive. If he could delay the Emperor's invasion of the Republic by 50 years, then Bastila might never have to endure the horrors of another galactic war. That was the measure and the goal, and while he fought for it in the dark, no one in the galaxy behind him knew where he was. The Jedi Council knew least of all. Because they knew nothing of what he had found, they understood nothing of what had happened. They did not know where Revan had gone. They did not know that Meetra had died in the same campaign. They did not know the name of the Sith Emperor, did not know he existed, did not know he had waited for centuries to march into the Republic. They knew only that Revan had disappeared, that he had broken his promise, and that he was gone. While Revan hung in his cage beyond the edge of the known galaxy, others in the Republic picked up fragments of what he and Malak had brought back from the unknown regions. A woman named Kreia, once a Jedi Master, gathered rogue Jedi around her and turned them toward the dark teachings Malak and Revan had uncovered. She took a new name, Darth Traya, and her followers called themselves the Sith after the long-lost species that had invaded the Republic a millennium before. They began a systematic purge of the galaxy, hunting down those who still held fast to the Jedi Code, killing them by the tens of thousands. The silence had not protected the Order. The silence had let the fire spread. Inside the temple, Malachor V remained sealed, and because it remained sealed, the mission report stayed buried in a section of the archives that ordinary students could not open. Among the Jedi, it was often said that if a record did not appear in the archive, then it did not exist. That was the principle of their library. In time, it became the principle of their memory too. Bastila lived on after Revan's disappearance. She raised the son they had had together, a boy named Vader. She raised him outside the Order. Vader would never be a Jedi. If he had been, he could never have married the woman he eventually married and would never have become the political leader he became. He grew up instead into a statesman who helped hold the Republic together in the years after the Sith Purge. A Jedi family, broken by Jedi rules, produced one of the men who rebuilt the galaxy. Out in his cage, Revan did exactly what he had set out to do. Year after year, decade after decade, he held his ground. He could not win free, but he could resist, and resistance became delayed. Delay became pressure. Pressure turned the Emperor inward, toward Dromund Kaas, toward the hidden Sith worlds, and towards the fragile order of his own dominion. Whatever plans he had once made for open war against the Republic were pushed back, not for months, but for decades. He bought far more time than he ever knew, and far more than the Republic ever realized it had been given. For a while, that was enough to alter the course of events. The attack on the Emperor's throne chamber had not killed him, but it had changed his priorities. The Republic was no longer the prize immediately before him. Instead, he turned his attention inward, toward the hidden machinery of his own empire, toward the worlds he already ruled, and toward the unstable order he could not afford to let fracture. The Jedi Council never knew any of it. Revan's final mission had not been sanctioned, so when he vanished beyond the edge of known space, the Temple had no record that could explain where he had gone or why. They could not prepare later generations for the enemy he had found, because they did not know that enemy existed. To them, Revan had simply disappeared again, as he had before, into a darkness no one in the Order could name. And because they did not know, they said nothing. The silence that had begun as caution hardened over time into custom. One generation of masters passed it on to the next, until omission no longer felt like a decision at all, but like the natural order of things. Padawans came and went, years gave way to centuries, and the answer remained the same. Revan was not discussed in any way that mattered. And if you want to understand how that forgotten war truly began, not with Revan, but with something far older, buried deep in the earliest days of the Sith, you can continue with the story that traces that darkness back to its origin. Or if you want to follow Revan himself beyond the fragments the Jedi left behind, from the Mandalorian Wars to the edge of the unknown regions, and the truth of what he found there, you can continue with the full account of his rise, fall, and return, because the Jedi chose what to remember. The rest of the story is still waiting.